So my name is Rebecca McCaffrey, and I'm on the North America board, and I'm the chapters rep. And this is Kevin Njabo, who is the global chapter committee chair. And we're just going to spend 2 minutes before we start our session today to kind of highlight chapters and to highlight the North America chapters and what's going on at this meeting and what chapters do. So as the North America rep, I just want you all to be aware that I'm here. And if you're interested in starting a North America chapter, learning more about chapters, we've got a number of events, and we've got our booth at the table, at the SCB table here, and we can answer any of your questions and try to help foster a great group of North America chapters. And I'll let Kevin talk about the chapters more broadly.
Okay, welcome everybody. And we hope you're going to stop by the booth to get some of the things, to look at what we're doing for the chapters around the world. We also hope that you're going to bid. We have some items which we're selling, and that is going to go on tomorrow for the silent auction. Please stop by the table, stop by the booth, and make sure you do your part. We're going to do everything to make sure the chapters really survive. And the chapters that's really the grassroots for the SCB, and we want to make sure it's really successful. So without much ado, it's our singular honor to introduce the moderator for this session. So the moderator for this session, Freshwater Connectivity in an Era of Global Change, is Marie-Josée Fortin, a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Toronto. She's a fellow of the Royal Society for Canada and holds a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Spatial Ecology. She's recognized internationally as a leader in spatial ecology with expertise in network theory to address both fundamental and applied research to conservation biodiversity and maintain species dispersal in fragmented landscapes. She pioneered the field of spatial ecology and contributed to numerous analytical methods. She was awarded the 2013 Distinguished Landscape Ecologist Award and the 2014 Highly Cited Researchers from Thomson Reuters in Ecology and Environment. She has more than 200 publications. Please join us to welcome Marie-Josée Fortin.
So good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming to this plenary on freshwater connectivity in an area of global change. And I think this plenary is relevant given the location of the meeting that is in Toronto, where we are the interface of one of the Great Lakes and land. And it's urban to the wild, so I think it's really is a good connectivity media of using water to address this issue. So we have the pleasure, the honor to have three distinguished plenary people. So we will start with the first one that will be given by Irina Cree. Irina Cree is a professor in watershed science. She was a Canadian research chair at the University of Western Ontario until 2017, a time at which she moved to the University of Saskatchewan. And this is the test in Canada. If you can spell Saskatchewan, you know that you're Canadian. And she took a position there as the executive director of the School of Sustainability. Things that is important to note, that is true for all my plenary speakers, they all have degrees from Canada. So Irina did her undergraduate, master, and PhD at the University of Toronto in 3 different departments. So she's multidisciplinary. So that's what we want for people that do conservation, and she is one of the rare persons that went from zoology, botany to geography and was a professor in biology. Her research interests are numerous. I will just name a few. She was interested in freshwater algal bloom. She is interested in healthy forests for healthy aquatic ecosystem, and she worked on the Great Lakes Future Project. But the list is too long, and I will let her present her research. Irina.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak, especially with my two colleagues here. The theme is on freshwater connectivity. Yesterday, we heard from Eli that everything is connected, and if it's not connected, it's dysfunctional. And so we want to talk today about connectivity and the proper functioning of freshwater landscapes. To me, I'm working on wetlands, wetlandscapes, and watersheds. First of all, I want to share with you what I see to be the problem. Governments worldwide are not adequately protecting freshwater ecosystems. Placing freshwater ecosystem functions and the associated services, including water purification, biodiversity, flood and drought mitigation, at risk. Particularly vulnerable are wetlands, which are being lost and degraded more quickly than any other ecosystem on the planet. In a recent study by Dahl, he showed a global assessment of wetland loss since 1970. On average, the global wetland loss is about 30% since that time. Whereas North America is showing a reduction in the rate of loss, mostly because they've already lost many of their wetlands. Some of the areas in Asia and Europe are still having really high rates of loss. And among the wetlands, geographically isolated wetlands, which are basically those outside of the floodplain and are embedded in landscapes, are particularly at risk. Canada has experienced some of the highest rate of wetland loss in the world, and in this map here you'll see the black areas are where there has been losses up to 90%, particularly located near some of the settled areas. GIWs, as I'll call them, geographically isolated wetlands, contribute to watershed functions, yet legal protections remain weak despite their preferential loss on landscapes. In this picture produced by a scientist from Ducks Unlimited, on the top you see the glory of the prairie pothole landscape with all of those potholes in their natural state. Below you see just how many are lost, and in this case in an agricultural landscape. Yet these GIWs stabilize water supplies, retain sediments, remove nutrients, and enhance biodiversity. In the Saskatchewan River drainage basin, we can see that flows into Lake Winnipeg. The loss of these GIWs has contributed to the bloom of the increase in the algal blooms. And in particular, cyanobacteria blooms are of particular concern. These algal blooms have been associated with hepatotoxins that affect your liver and neurotoxins that have been associated with things including Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. Within the Saskatchewan River Basin, if you look at Water Today, which is an online web-based data tool, you'll see just how many algal bloom advisories occur. In this snapshot that I took for just Alberta and just in 2015, you could see all the cities that had reports of these cyanobacteria blooms. In 2012, there was a national survey that found that liver toxins were highest in Alberta and Manitoba lakes. And what do you do if you find that you have a cyanobacteria advisory? Well, you can't boil the water, you can't swim in the water, and you need to keep your pets away from the water because livestock and pets have been found to die as a result of that exposure. Lake Winnipeg and has been cited as the 2013, talk about being able to have something that you can claim as your own, the 2013 most threatened lake in the world. And you can see some of the problems here shown in the pictures, the pea soup kind of thing of walking in Lake Winnipeg. This is a product of eutrophication. The prairie pothole wetlands that have been lost have contributed to that. And as Peter Thornton said, eutrophication is a wicked problem that cannot be solved but can be managed. And my friend and colleague Bob Sanford, who's a Canadian author, talked about eutrophication as the environmental problem of the century. So I've shown the importance of these wetlands, but now I'm going to turn to some of the politics that are at play. Recent events in the United States remind us that we cannot rely on federal governments to protect our fresh waters. Rather, we need to look to local, state, and tribal governments, and they need to be involved in both protection and restoration of geographically isolated wetlands, but also all vulnerable waters. So just to give those in the audience who are not familiar with the laws in the United States, the Clean Water Act from 1972 has been the main federal tool for protecting GIWs in the United States. The Clean Water Act goal is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the waters of the United States. What are the waters of the United States? They include navigable waters, interstate waters, intrastate waters, impoundments, tributaries, territorial seas, and adjacent waters. So that basically covers it all. Yet, and under this Clean Water Act of 1972, virtually all wetlands were federally regulated. However, legal challenges then pursued. And many of these legal challenges culminated in the 2006 U.S. Supreme Court decision requiring that wetlands had to have a significant nexus to navigable waters for protection. This is the famous Rapanos versus United States debate. And in the end, there was a 4-1-4 decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. And they basically they decided how to define a wetland. So on the right-hand side, you have 4 individuals who supported that the Clean Water Act should protect all waters. On the left-hand side, you have 4 individuals who said there had to be a permanent connection to the navigable waters. And in the middle, you have Justice Kennedy, who said that it had to be a significant nexus in order for it to be regulated. And in this, where the whole debate about connectivity then emerged. Connectivity matters. Scalia said that relatively permanent standing or flowing bodies of water implied a duration of the connection was important for it to be protected. And Kennedy said significant nexus, which then led to the question of what is a significant connection? The United States Environmental Protection Agency, in light of this decision, conducted a state-of-the-art of science review. And basically, they synthesized 1,200 peer-reviewed articles, had 34 external peer reviewers, and their conclusion was that rivers, tributaries, and riparian wetlands are unequivocally waters of the United States. However, GIWs may or may not be waters of the United States. This report was key in what came out to be, in 2015, the Clean Water Rule. This was put forth by the US EPA and the US Army Corps of Engineers. And this was the definitive thing about what the waters of the United States would be. Here, geographically isolated waters can be jurisdictional if case-specific analysis demonstrates a significant nexus with navigable waters. I still find this very ambiguous. I hope that you agree with that. So, a group of us working with the United States EPA scientists started to conduct our own independent kind of review of the literature. First of all, Dave Moshe from the USGS said that the geographically isolated wetlands was part of the confusion. By including the term isolated, it meant that they were not connected to navigable waters and therefore should not be protected. Since then, we also produced a paper that was published in PNAS, Do Geographically Isolated Wetlands Influence Landscape Functions? The answer was an absolute yes. Sometimes the isolation is a benefit to the downstream waters. If you can imagine you're storing carbon, you're storing phosphorus, you're preventing some of the eutrophication downstream, but they all have some relationship to those downstream waters. We then went systematically to show the importance of the GIWs, both from a hydrologic perspective, a biogeochemical perspective, and a biodiversity perspective, and even went to show how managers, land managers, can start integrating GIWs in terms of how they manage those landscapes. So, this all happened, and talk about being involved in something that is in the news all the time. This was the topic to pick. With the Clean Water Rule that was signed and was to become in effect on October 10th, 2015, chaos basically followed the signing of that rule. One day before it was to become in effect, a nationwide stay temporarily halts the implementation. Then on February 28th, 2017, President Trump signs the executive order directing the EPA to review the rule for conflicts with economic growth agendas. July 27th, 2017, the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers published the notice of proposed ruling to review and revise what is meant by waters of the United States. January 22nd, the U.S. Supreme Court finally lifts that nationwide stay on the rule, only immediately to have Trump on February 6th formally suspend the rule. On June 28th, just last month, Justice Kennedy retires, and that is significant as shown in this news article. With Kennedy's exit, the tide turns on the Clean Water Rule. A few weeks later, July 12th, 2018, the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers now publish a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking saying that they're going to repeal the definition of waters of the United States. And presently, it's open to a comment period that will end August 11th, 2018, after which we'll figure out what is a water of the United States, I hope. Or not, because I'm not sure it's going in the right direction. There's some scientist, writer, Wittenberg, who wrote something that really spoke to me, and I wonder if it would also speak to you. Obama's wetlands protection rule put too much emphasis on science, Trump officials argue. And here are two quotes, two contrasting quotes. It's baffling for a science-based agency to say that they relied too much on science, is one position. The other one is, the agencies need to worry primarily about the statute and the Constitution, not what the report said. Science informs policymakers. It does not give us an answer to policy questions. That alone makes me feel very saddened as a scientist who cares deeply about having their science implement for positive, transformative change. So what are our options moving forward? The only options that myself and my collaborators looked at were that local, state, and tribal governments need science-based options and tools to protect these vulnerable waters. And in a recent paper that we published called Enhancing Protection for Vulnerable Waters, we identified three options. The first, which is the most precautionary approach, is that we should protect all vulnerable waters. And in this case, it is the scientific position that we're not smart enough, we don't know enough to know how much you can actually remove before it's too much. The second option is to protect those vulnerable waters with quantifiable effects on downstream waters. And the third one, which is perhaps the most liberal of the three, is that we can protect and restore a portfolio of functions that vulnerable waters provide to downstream waters. Recognize here that we're looking at saving some of them. In the equivalent language of species at risk, you're going to save representatives of each of them, but you're going to let some of them go. And so this third one may be the one that's most realistic as ongoing human development activities occur to feed the world, to grow the economy, but we need to maintain these portfolio functions. Now, some people feel that this is pie in the sky. It is not realistic. We do not have the scientific tools to do this. I would like to show you some of the research in my group that is starting to show that we are developing tools that we could, if necessary, develop a portfolio of functions option. It uses smart design and state-of-the-art technologies to protect and restore vulnerable waters. The first one, and all the examples I'm going to show you, draw from my 20 years of working in the province of Alberta, and most recently helping them design tools for their wetland policy. In this case, I'm focusing on Beaver Hill watershed. It drains into the North Saskatchewan River. It's about 500,000 hectares, over 100,000 wetlands, and has wetlands of international significance, including a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve and a Beaver Hill Lake that is Ramsar wetland. The first thing is, if you can't map it, you can't manage it. And yet, in Canada, and I'm sure many places in the world, we do not have effective wetland inventories or inventories of our vulnerable waters. With the introduction of LIDAR, light detection and ranging technology, where we can get into 0.5 meter to 1 meter resolution of the terrain, we're starting to be able to come up with world-class wetland inventories. And this is just some of the tools where we did a hybrid of LIDAR and satellite imagery to produce some of the best wetland inventories for this region. One of the things that you can do when you have that wetland inventory is that if you look at a power law function of frequency and area, you can actually estimate the permanent loss of wetlands that have occurred on that landscape. So if the blue line represents what the historical baseline of wetlands is supposed to be, the deviation means that those are ones that are permanently lost. And never before have we been able to even come up with an estimate of wetlands that were permanently lost. If you then put other time series, in this case we went to the earliest air photo inventory from 1962, you can then identify those wetlands that were temporarily lost. That means they still have the topographic depression, they're just not functioning like a wetland any longer. And often that's because there's been a ditch put through it to avoid the flooding, to allow in agricultural landscapes crops to be planted there or cattle to go there. So now we can starting to get some of the estimates of what the true loss of wetlands have been. In this case, in Beaver Hill watershed, we find 67% in the number of wetlands were lost and 31% in the area of wetlands were lost. Other tools that we're developing is trying to figure out where can we find the easiest, cheapest way to restore wetlands. And as I mentioned, that drainage ditch that is often used to remove the wetland, we just need to plug it. And much of the work of Ducks Unlimited in Canada and beyond is about plugging those drained ditches so that they can start functioning as wetlands again. And using this new technique that we've recently published, we can identify in the Beaver Hills that 466 ditch-drained wetlands that basically can be restored at the cost of about 5,000 to 10,000 Canadian dollars. Step 2 is to measure the functions of these wetlands. And led by the Government of Alberta's function-based wetland policy, we participated in an evaluation of hundreds of indicators of wetland function. We focused on 4 areas: hydrologic health, water purification, ecological health, and human use. And we're able to come up with grades for what class of functioning those wetlands were, an A, a B, or a C, or a D. A being, of course, the highest functioning wetland. And when we look here, we can now show that we can map where are the highest functioning ones. One of the things is, as a land manager, which one do you, it's like having a child or many children, and which one are you going to let leave the house or stay? And in this case, it's which wetland are you going to allow a developer to pave over so that they can put up new housing. Here we now have tools that show where the highest functioning wetlands are, with the belief that you can't always create high functioning wetlands, and those should be protected at all cost. We can also show that restorable wetlands have also high potential for being high functioning on the left-hand side for the hydrologic health, water quality, and ecological health, what the current distribution of functions are, and what the potential is with the restorable wetlands on the right-hand side. The next thing is to look at measuring connectivity among wetlands. The whole Government of Alberta wetland policy looks at a wetland as an individual, independent object. Everyone in the room probably knows that there's connection amongst these wetlands. And those are what we call now wetlandscapes, landscapes with a large number of wetlands that are hydrologically connected. And we know that moving amongst these independent objects on the landscape are actually exchanges of mass, energy, and organisms, and that we need to start developing policies that look at these types of wetlandscapes. One example, again taken from Alberta, will be looking at the role of these wetlandscapes for the protection of amphibians. And in this case, I'm looking at the northern leopard frog and the Great Plains toad. I chose those two because one of them really loves the water and spends a lot of its life cycle in water, and the other one is mostly on the plains and only spends a short period of time in the water. And what we're now developing are these tools that look not only at the quality of the habitat in terms of a wetland attractiveness index on the top, but now the kind of domain in the network within that wetlandscape that that amphibian depends on, and that's called the Wetland Connectivity Index. Those of you who happened to see Christian Messier's talk in the session before, he talked about this in terms of forest fragmentation and the need to have functional traits to keep that kind of biodiversity optimized. And here I'm doing the same thing on the grasslands, where we're looking at how does the amphibian view the world in the terms of the water and the wet landscape. So on the bottom left, you'll see that the northern leopard frog moves around a lot in that landscape, and the dark purple area shows that there's quite a bit of land that it covers, whereas the Great Plain toad is much more restrictive. What does this information give us? It now allows managers to come up with, what are we managing for? We can manage for the connections, we can manage for the habitat, or where we find that there are wetlands that both have high quality connections and habitat, that those should maybe be ones that are priority wetlands to protect. Finally, we want to measure the connectivity to the river network. Now, this has been one of the most challenging things in the 20 years that I've been working in Alberta. How do you model the subsurface connections, especially when you have a very deep stratigraphy and very complex hydrogeology? Some of the more recent work from postdoc Amelie from my lab is to develop new analytical modeling techniques. We have shown really good comparison between what's observed and what is modeled. So we have confidence that we're actually able to model groundwater recharge and discharge areas. And now we can actually model connections underground from individual wetlands all the way to the North Saskatchewan River in this case, or to that Ramsar site. And what we find is that wetland loss is changing the sources. The number of connections to the river and to the lake are actually increasing because most of those shorter connections among wetlands have disappeared. It also lengthens the pathways and decelerates the pathways of groundwater to the river and the lake. What that means is that the water that you're now going to get in the river is going to be older. It has a higher risk of having more contaminants in it, and it's going to be more vulnerable as you're not getting the rapid replenishment of water to this groundwater system. And then finally, we can start looking at how can we measure functions at the watershed scale. This is one simple example, and it focuses just on the water. In this, we're looking at Nose Creek, which is it drains into Calgary, the city of Calgary. We focused on this one because in 2013, there was a major flood, and the flood cost billions of dollars for people living in Calgary. And I actually had my tech's family, the home was destroyed as a result of that flood. And so when we look here, we wanted to say, what was the role of those GIWs? And if they were on that landscape, would they have protected that flood, against that flood, at least in some incremental way? What we show here is that all wetlands on the landscape are not equal. We did this scenario analysis where we took wetlands that were greater than 4 kilometers from the main river, those between 2 and 4 kilometers, those within 102 kilometers, and then one within 100 meters. And basically, every wetland in this one case contributed equally to the base flow of that main stem. But what we show here is in terms of the peak flow, that those far away from the main stem actually contributed very little to the peak flow. But here, once again, within 100 meters, if those wetlands were there, we could have diminished the peak flow, in this case, by almost 300 cubic meters per day. So I've shown that there are tools out there and that those tools can be adopted by local, state, and tribal governments. Now we want to look at what incentives that we could create. It will take a community to protect vulnerable waters such as GIWs and policy levers and incentives to change the behavior of members of the community. Now, we could talk about a number of different things, including carbon markets, phosphorus markets, biodiversity, and I've actually been involved in at least the carbon and phosphorus ones. But one example of a policy lever, again, taken from the government of Alberta, is that they want to avoid destruction of wetlands wherever possible. If not, they want to minimize the impact on the wetland, and if that's not possible, they want to replace it. And here's where the incentive comes in, where if you were to destroy an A-quality wetland, you would have to replace it with 8 times the area of a D-functioning wetland. And so it's not a 1-for-1. You destroy 1 hectare, you're going to replace 1 hectare. But here, the policy lever is if you're going to destroy one high-quality one, which we would try to avoid at all costs, that you would have to replace it with almost 10 times that amount. So my final slide gets back to connectivity, and where I showed you the kind of confusion, and I still find it confusing, that term of significant nexus. I would argue that all GIWs have a nexus to navigable waters, the significance of which depends on the management target. If you care about biodiversity, they're all important. If you care about carbon or phosphorus retention, they're all important. If you care about phosphorus going down to eutrophied downstream waters, you may begin to pick and choose which one you might want to protect. And I would advocate for a portfolio of functions management strategy to ensure that the diversity of functions are protected while allowing for ongoing development activities to occur. I say that because I recognize that our first option of protecting all vulnerable waters will never happen. But if we use our smart design and our science to be able to show which ones we can sacrifice, then we'll at least be able to protect the function of those watersheds. Thank you.
Thank you, Arina, for a fantastic talk. Our next speaker is Julian Olden. Julian is, I hope I will pronounce that properly. You know that I cannot pronounce English words. Is a H, I don't know for what, Mason, Keller, and Dunn professor at the School of Aquatic and Fisheries Science at the University of Washington. Julian and Irina are sharing a few things, they don't know it. They both did their undergraduate degree in the Department of Zoology at the University of Toronto. Then Julian continued his master at the University of Toronto, but he migrated to do his PG at the University of Colorado State. Julian is known to the society here because he won the Society Conservation Biology Early Career Conservationist Award, and then he got the ESA Early Fellow Award. His research interest is also very, very long, so I will name only a few. He's interested in water resource management, invasive species, river and dam, climate change, and of course the list is much longer than that. And I will let Julian talk about it. Julian.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. How are you guys doing today? It is so wonderful to be here back in my home city of Toronto. I kind of flew in here and had a lot of good reminders of my time spent at the University of Washington, where I did an undergrad and master's degree. We're going to get some serious feedback. How's that work, guys? Perfect. And I was really reminded of kind of some of the early formative years that I had. I remember that first time I cracked open that Began, Harper, and Townsend ecology textbook, and that wonderful smell, you know, back when we read textbooks, pink cover, instilling many of the fundamental principles of what drives really sustainable ecosystems and a lot of the biogeographical principles upon which my master's work was based on. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about that work and some more recent studies that are really questioning just what degree of connectivity is important across the landscape and where in instances discontinuity is actually very important. So there's many agents of riverine fragmentation when we look across the landscape. There's agents such as the natural ones that we see here, waterfalls or cascades in which organisms have difficulty moving across. The favorite Canadian beaver, which often dams or impounds areas in which organisms can't move across, or even drying streams. Much of my work is focusing on more kind of anthropogenic agents of environmental change, things such as dams, perched culverts, levees, or even polluted waters. So much of my work now is focusing in the United States, where we have a rich history of damming our waters. This is just a graphic where each black dot is the creation or construction of a new dam across the United States. And you can see as we progress through time, there's been kind of this progression of large dams being built from the east across to the west. Early settlers often first built churches and then created dams in order to harness waters. Throughout the 20s, starting in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and into the 60s, you can see that there's an explosion, if you will, of dam construction across the United States. So these dams collectively fragment about 98% of all water courses. And in fact, there's only a handful of free-flowing, medium-sized rivers left in the United States. Now, this is replicated also globally. This is just a map, and this is actually the only tweet-free zone. If anyone is doing that out there, I wish Trump would actually listen to this advice as well. But this is just a dammed kind of landscape in which we're looking at right now, where you look at even globally across the world, there's not many free-flowing rivers left. And this is in large part because of those dams, both small and large, that are getting built. These dams are collectively, through time, basically decreasing the connectivity or increasing the frequency, the fragmentation of our river systems. So this shows some large major rivers, including the Mississippi and the Columbia and some major rivers in Southeast Asia, which shows a very big decline in the degree of connectivity through time. And this has really important implications for a large number of species, including migratory fish like the Pacific salmon that we see in the Columbia River system, or large European sturgeon, or even the finless porpoise in the Yangtze River. These are all organisms require large amounts of habitat. Now, there's just not these large dams which fragment freshwater systems, but raised culverts where roads go over river systems are actually a major source. So if you think about the tens of millions of kilometers, for example, of roads across the United States, this is definitely the rule and not the exception. And in fact, even if we look within the Great Lakes region, there's about 250,000 road crossings, which is about 40 times the number of small and large dams in the basin. This is a real agent of fragmentation across these systems. And in large part, again, this is really reducing opportunities for organisms such as fish to move around. So these are just a couple agents of fragmentation within river systems. And in fact, restoring lost habitat connectivity is really a pillar of modern conservation strategies, both in freshwaters and in terrestrial ecosystems. These are things in which I teach my students that are important. We learn as students are being important and are really implemented in both current day management actions as well as looking to the future in terms of more adaptation strategies for climate change. But and for this reason, things like this are actually quite promising. So although we've, in the developing nations, we have really an era of dam construction, dam removal is now occurring in many parts around the world. And although they're not as all dramatic here as the Connick Dam in Washington State, for all you Hay Duke lovers out there, the number of cumulative numbers of dams, mainly small, are really increasing. We're looking at around, the 1,000 or so dams have been removed across the United States, and this is all in the name of reconnecting habitat and allowing migratory fish, for example, to move around. But in many of those situations, removal of dams is not possible or even warranted, given that they still have very strong and important economic roles across our landscape. So fishways or fish ladders have also been ways of connecting. This is a perched culvert, which is a barrier. And take a look at this cute little fish ladder. Here, this is in New Zealand for small native fish, galactus, that kind of move up through that fish ladder. Now, of course, these can scale up. Things like this, which I call the Home Depot or Canadian Tire version of these types of fish ladders. $1,000 is a PVC pipe, and you can try to connect down water to up water. These then actually can be even scaled but made more natural features, such as these rock barriers, which allow fish to move up, rest in slow-moving habitat, and then continue on their journey. The more elaborate fish ladders, such as these engineered marvels shown here. This is on the Columbia River and the John Day Dam. And then there's actually some increasing and very interesting technology like these screw ladders, which actually allow fish to be moved upstream as this is turning, as well as fish moving downstream, and at the same time actually creating hydroelectricity. So there's an interesting array of ways in which we try to move fish and other organisms through these barriers, and probably the most interesting one is the one at Paradise Dam here in the Burnett River in Queensland, Australia, in which this elevator has been constructed to move down the face of the dam to move endangered Australian lungfish up and down. So if you're too lazy to use a ladder, you can use an elevator. And no worry, $200 million later, we'll get fish there. All right. Now, of course, there's all these culverts also, which are a major issue in terms of fragmenting landscapes. And there's been really the development of fish-friendly passage, where these perched culverts, which provide velocity barriers, log jams, and the inability of fish, for example, to jump up and move upstream, have been then converted into things like this, which have more natural habitat, allow fish passage to kind of continue upstream, and to be really less cluttered with kind of coarse woody habitat as it jams through there during flooding time. Now, these are all, again, really pillars or the mainstay in which aquatic ecologists in riverine settings think about reconnecting landscapes. We're talking about multi-billion-dollar industries to basically try to reconnect and convert these culverts or remove dams in the way in which we think about things. Those are all exceedingly very important things that we do, and are all very much based on the biotic assemblages or the biological context of the past. When we move to the future, we live in invaded landscapes. Landscapes now, in many cases, have more non-native or invasive species than native species. And the reality is, when we think about reconnecting these landscapes, we need to also think about basically the biological fabric upon which the species are going to respond to that increased connectivity. So actually maintaining or creating fragmented riverscapes actually may be beneficial in many circumstances. So if you indulge me, we'll talk about some examples from the literature which supports this. For example, current barriers in many riverine landscapes are actually preventing non-native species from moving upstream. There's some great examples of red swamp crayfish shown here in California streams, which are unable to penetrate up into headwaters because of culverts which have very high velocity stream and often are perched, so they cannot move upstream. Similar examples of work actually by Jake and others in the Great Lakes have shown actually that tributary systems in the Lake Michigan area actually, these dams actually prevent Round Goby from moving upstream. And in fact, in a large majority of cases, Round Goby have not been able to penetrate some headwaters because of the presence of dams. There's also instances in which we want to put in artificial barriers to stop the movement of non-native species. Some great examples from Australia is stopping carp from moving upstream, particularly during spawning time. If you can't see the water, it's okay, it's on the backs of these common carp as they push forward, and there's these large screens which prevent them from going upstream, as well as into more isolated wetlands in which they prefer to spawn. And here, in the Great Lakes area, the great example obviously is sea lamprey, where there's been a phenomenal amount of work to basically actually engineer or do pop-up dams to stop sea lamprey from coming in and spawning upstream. And of course, one of the best examples of barriers is in the Chicago Shipping Canal or Sanitation Canal, in which electric barriers have been installed to try to stop Asian carp from moving upstream into the Great Lakes. So these are all very important examples, and again, where barriers are really, or fragmenting the landscapes play really large roles. And a final one is actually the isolation of backwaters or lakes to provide native fish sanctuaries. So in the desert Southwest, where I do a lot of my work, there's actually been artificially disconnected from a lot of these large lake systems so that native fish can be reared and then reintroduced into the wild. Some other great examples are actually preventing the spread of organisms which have diseases or parasites. So in Europe, for example, a number of dams have gone in to prevent the crayfish plague. So basically, crayfish with parasites to move upstream to infect native crayfish populations. Or whirling disease here in the western part of the United States. A lot of dams have gone in to actually stop whirling disease infected fish from moving upstream, because often then that's going to then infect wild populations. Another great example is actually creating barriers to prevent hybridization. Again, throughout much of the western United States, there's been a number of barriers that have gone in, such as this one shown here, to isolate headwater cutthroat trout populations from non-native brown, rainbow, and brook trout populations so that hybridization or integration can't occur. So this really raises this issue, or this conundrum, if you will, of how much connectivity is enough, and how should we manage these systems so that we can try to allow desirable species to be moved around, but yet undesirable species not to. So really, essentially, in previously, fragmented all too often is viewed as black and white. You're either fragmented or not. And along this continuum, if you will, we might expect conservation actions to occur. For example, if we want to maintain high connectivity, we might remove dams and promote barrier passage, kind of the classic approach. We might want to maintain or build artificial barriers if it's low. And then there's this very large shades of gray that occur between. Ways in which we might think about selective fragmentation by using barriers in a way so that we can allow some species to pass and others not to. So there's been really interesting work to think a little bit about this. Frank Rahel, for example, University of Wyoming, has really done some really neat work to think about also how can we do this, and traits-based approaches to think about also how we might be able to provide these semi-permeable barriers. For example, we know that jumping ability among fish, for example, vary greatly, so we can construct artificial dams, a weir height at a certain height to allow native species to pass, but not non-native species. This is an example from Europe which shows probability of successful jumping leaps of a non-native minnow at around 27 centimeters. It cannot jump any higher than that. So artificial weirs at around 30 centimeters have been built, which stops this non-native small-bodied fish from moving upstream, but brown trout have no problem native brown trout have no problem jumping over that. Examples here, sea lamprey is another great example, but in this case, it's the lack of jumping ability, where lampreys are actually attached themselves and move themselves over barriers, so you can actually provide suitable substrate for lampreys to move over and then trap themselves and then be removed from areas above the dam, whereas other fish can then just swim through this fishway. Morphology is another trait, if you will, that can be used for selective fragmentation. This is a great example of common carp in Australia. Common carp, if anyone's ever seen it, it's by far the most ugliest fish ever in the world. Second only to Asian carp, but it's a big-bodied carp, diamond-shaped, very thick. And there's been actually some really interesting work to kind of develop these collection traps, if you will, which restrict the passage of deep-bodied fish and only allow thin-bodied fish from moving in. Those are native fish. So this is an interesting, poor graphic, unfortunately, but small-bodied fish can move through these grates easily and then stay in the bottom part of this chamber, whereas deeper-bodied common carp will actually go up into this upper chamber or even jump. They really jump a little bit into this chamber. Once this is filled, This apparatus will then go up and empty into a big truck. And then that carp is actually then used for fish food, it's used for fertilizer, it's used for a whole variety of things. This allows 99.9% of all native fish go through this, and it eliminates about 70% of carp. So it does a pretty good job. There's also, we can then also harness the sensory ability, if you will, of particular organisms. This is another example using carp, in this case Asian carp, with this idea of, can we actually use acoustic or visual sensitivities to actually try to filter out some species and not others. So this idea of can we use biological deterrents, and in this case it's using basically through bubbling of water, high strobe lights, as well as pounding sound. So it's kind of like an underwater disco, if you will, for Asian carp. This is an example of it right here where you have underwater speakers making sound, you have strobe lights. This sounds like a really fun night on Yonge Street. To create these barriers, if you will, it hinges on something that's really interesting, a highly developed kind of sensory cues of Asian carp. It's the reason why they jump out of water when they hear vibrating water from outboard engines. So they actually harness that to try to prevent carp from moving through these bubble fields, if you will. And it's been actually highly effective to do that while allowing other fish to move through freely. And then finally, we can hinge on things like phenology or the timing of spawning. So a great example is sea lamprey here, where they have a 70 to 80 day window in which they have mass spawning events. And these traps can temporarily be put into streams to capture lamprey and remove them during that spawning period. Another great example here is carp, where you actually have these rotating, if you will, barriers, where they're only closed during certain times of the year, and then they're open during other times of the year, so we can match that. So these are just some examples of the ways in which selective fragmentation on the landscape provides one approach to solve this conundrum of too much or too less connectivity. Now the problem is that it's not 100% successful. Just like us in this room, how much we vary individually within the same species, so do fish and other organisms. So jumping ability varies, thickness body of fish varies, bubbles as deterrent varies. All of these things mean that 100% selectivity is very, very, very difficult to do. So there has been more active ways of doing this in which at traps, like the carp one I showed you previously, where all fish are caught, fish are hand sorted, and only those that are allowed to pass, and all the other ones are not. So those are really kind of the more intensive approaches. There's been technology to use basically underwater fish identification approaches like they've done for salmon in the Northwest to see whether or not we can actually automatically sort fish through those genetic algorithms and allow only those viable fish to pass and not others. So there's a lot of technology and interesting questions out there. But in general, there's a lot of really interesting ways in which we might capitalize on this opportunity to think about how we try to manage aquatic systems, especially with this challenge that we have moving forward in terms of aging infrastructure, both in terms of dams and roads, as well as the fact that many roads, billions of kilometers of roads, are planned by 2050 within the United States. So how do we design these structures in a way that doesn't always allow all species or allow complete biological connectivity, but maybe will still facilitate hydrologic connectivity between these systems? And that's a challenge, particularly when we're thinking about highly invaded landscapes, which is now the norm, not the exception. So I think as a group, and many of you are terrestrial ecologists out there, we have something very much in common. Many of you are interested in connectivity over highways and how this connects vast landscapes. Freshwater ecologists are interested in going under the road and understanding how we can promote connectivity between river systems. You have predator exclusion fences, for example, here in New Zealand, try to restore areas. We have predator exclusion fences and barriers that we put in freshwater systems exactly the same way. So there's many principles, there's many lessons learned, no matter what the medium is. And ultimately, this all comes down to what I consider the Goldilocks principle. We don't want too much connectivity because it allows non-native species to move around. Too less connectivity, obviously, then eliminates all the opportunities for the advantages of genetic exchange, rescue, metapopulations, et cetera. So how do we manage or think about systems where connectivity is just right? And this is an unfolding story, and a story which I don't know what the answer is, but I look forward to working on all of this with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian, for a great talk. So we are at our third plenary speaker. So it's Jake van der Zenden. He is I'm sorry, I'm going to always mispronounce those words, sorry. Wayland Nolan Distinguished Chair. He's the director of the Center for Limnology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He shares some aspect with our two previous speakers, but he went to McGill instead of U of T, so he has a Canadian undergraduate and PhD from McGill. His research interest also is very long. Just to name a few, he's interested in the study of factors that degrade freshwater ecosystem, invasive species, food web, water quality, managing sustainable fishery, and climate change. So I think we move medium here.
All right, well, thank you. All right, wonderful. Well, I'm a limnologist, so I'm going to bring a discussion on lake ecosystems today, which I think complements nicely our first talk, which focused on wetlands, and then Julian, who talked primarily about stream ecosystems. My talk will not include any underwater discos or explosions, but nevertheless, I'll do what I can. So my approach for my talk is going to be to present an environmental history, and I'm going to focus on the Laurentian Great Lakes, which are the watershed that we are currently in. And so I know many of you come from across North America, so you could view this as an opportunity to learn a little bit more about the home watershed where we are. I'm going to talk about the environmental history of this watershed, but using connectivity as a lens to kind of explore some of these environmental changes that have happened. And I think the concept of connectivity runs through the dramatic environmental changes that we've seen in the Great Lakes and the surrounding area. So, quick overview. I'm going to talk about the defining features of lake connectivity in the Great Lakes in the region. So that's basically, what is this system? How is connectivity configured historically prior to anthropogenic impacts? I'll talk about the dominant human impacts on lake connectivity at different scales, and again, focusing on the lakes, but also reaching out to the watershed, and then touch on the conservation implications as well. So to start off, the Laurentian Great Lakes, even though I've been working on them for a long time, continue to boggle my mind with their vastness and the fact that when you're out on the Great Lakes, you feel like you're in the ocean, except it's fresh water. And it continues to astound me that that's the case. 94,000 square miles. 20% of the surface available fresh water is contained in these water bodies, and they are a fundamental, critical life support system for the people in this region. They are astounding ecosystems, and they still amaze me as I move through and work on these systems. They owe their existence to the destructive forces of glaciers. And if we were to go back 14,000 years ago, North America would have looked like this. Where we are now would have been covered in glaciers, a mile high. These glaciers retreated and destroyed the landscape. And in the wake of their retreat was very bad drainage. They left gouges, and they left behind a situation where water was not running efficiently off the land, and the consequence was a lot of lakes on the landscape. And so the watershed for the Great Lakes was essentially left behind in the wake of those glaciers not too long ago, just 12,000 years ago. This is the watershed for the Great Lakes, and the watershed itself has 2,400 tributary streams that drain into it. So it's hard to think about the lakes without recognizing those connections to the surrounding tributaries. There are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of inland lakes within this watershed as well. Those inland lakes might be connected to the Great Lakes via streams, but there are also natural barriers, and many of the inland lakes are actually isolated in that they don't have any stream connections at all. So that degree of connectivity within the basin is highly heterogeneous. And then finally, I want to note that the basin itself is isolated, and that isolation defines much of the biodiversity of the system. So fish cannot easily move from outside of the basin, let's say the Mississippi River Basin here, into the Great Lakes Basin. The watershed has been relatively stable for thousands of years, and there are isolating mechanisms at the outflow of the basin as well. The first is the St. Lawrence River, which drains out of Lake Ontario, and there are brutal rapids at the outflow of Lake Ontario that would prevent species from moving in. And the other key isolating factor is located right here, and that's Niagara Falls, which is shown here. And Niagara Falls is a significant barrier to the movement of fish upstream. Fish are not going to pass this barrier. And as a consequence, the biota of the Great Lakes, which was established after the retreat of the glaciers, has not been subject to incoming species and biogeographic colonization because of the presence of these barriers. Not to say that no fish has ever come in the last 10,000 years, but the community has been relatively protected from the input of new species under natural conditions. And so what you have is a relatively isolated, naive biological community, which ends up being quite vulnerable to inputs of new species, which becomes a big factor a couple slides from now. All right, so that's the basic 101 natural history of the Great Lakes and the watershed, and so you have a bit of a context for thinking about the anthropogenic impacts. I want to talk now about the dominant human impacts on connectivity in this watershed at different scales, and then what it means for conservation. And I won't talk about that second one too much because I don't think we'll have time, and that's something we might leave for the panel as well. So these resources had tremendous productivity with regards to fish. The native people were sustained by the fish of the Great Lakes for thousands of years. The voyageurs, the French voyageurs who moved through the Great Lakes in the 1600s described a tremendous bounty and abundance of fish. Sturgeon, whitefish, trout, and pike. They described the tremendous manna that these lakes offered. And I want to note that these fish species that are mentioned here are species that rely on these nearshore and estuary types of habitats within the Great Lakes. So I just want to note that those are, they're relying on some pretty vulnerable habitats. So these were incredibly productive ecosystems. It was recognized by people for a long time and early on. Europeans settled the Great Lakes in the early 1800s, and if we look from the 1820s through the 1850s, there was a wave of European migrants through this region. The Great Lakes were really the frontier at this time. And so there was massive widespread deforestation. The forests were leveled. It led to stream sedimentation and destruction of the stream habitats in the area. There were dams that started to go in. Julian showed that very nicely. But around this time, dams on the major tributaries started going in, as well as road crossings, which are not shown here. And these had a really major impact on this connectivity. And these degradations began in the mid and early 1800s. If we look at the situation today, it's much worse. The amount of connectivity barriers within the watershed, if we combine dams and road crossings, is 270,000 from some recent work from Pete McIntyre's lab. This map shows that these barriers to connectivity within the watershed span both sides of the border and are absolutely widespread in the watershed. And these are things that inhibit the movement of fish within this basin. This has had some really major impacts on the Great Lakes fishes as well. So you might be thinking about way up in the watershed, but there have been impacts on the Great Lakes themselves. And so species like lake sturgeon, lake whitefish, lake trout, and pike, which relied on these estuary habitats and tributary streams for spawning, their populations were majorly affected by this already back in the 1800s. And one thing that's really important to note is that these fish species lost a lot of stock diversity. And so a species like the lake trout, shown here, it was not one species, but there were many, many subpopulations that were distinct and locally adapted and relied on some of these estuary habitats. And with this destruction, the intra-population diversity of species like lake trout was degraded very early on. This is just a reminder that, again, harkening back to the frontier and the European migrants coming into North America in the 1800s, it was a challenging situation for them because there were no roads, there were wetlands everywhere, and the rate of movement into the interior was very slow. There was also difficulty in moving goods and moving people across the landscape. This was an area that was largely undeveloped. And so the approach that they used was to build canals. And canals really ended up becoming the superhighways of the frontier. The Erie Canal was completed in 1825, and this had quite a remarkable effect in that it connected the Hudson River, somewhere near Albany, across to the Great Lakes. So this was a major public works project for the time, and what it meant was that you could take a ship with a bunch of cargo from New York City, chug up the Hudson River, go across the state of New York, and have your ship onto the Great Lakes, and then move your ship inland. So this was a quantum leap in trade and commerce for the region, and this is just one example of the canals that came in and started to transform the frontier. Another one, not to be outdone, the Canadians and the Welland Canal in 1829. The Welland Canal wasn't as long, but it played the critical role of connecting Lake Ontario to Lake Erie, bypassing Niagara Falls, which was that biological barrier. So now ships can move back and forth between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, again, causing a massive increase in the movement of products and people on the landscape. Again, a critical part of the sort of development of the frontier at that time. Another thing I should mention is the Chicago Shipping Canal, which originally was developed in the 1830s and 1840s. This map shows Chicago before it was Chicago. And it's quite remarkable. The Des Plaines River drains out into the Mississippi River Basin. The Chicago River hugs Lake Michigan and drains into Lake Michigan. There was a tiny little wetland between the two that was used as a portage by the Native Americans and the early French traders that was discovered that allowed people to easily transport from the Mississippi Basin into the Lake Michigan Basin. And there was just this little place called Mud Lake, an easy portage. In the 1830s, they started to put a canal in there. By the 1840s, it was finished. And this canal essentially was what made Chicago what it is. It went from a little trading outpost in the middle of nowhere to a city of over 100,000 people within a decade or so. And it was this building canals and having this potential for trade and moving goods across the landscape, which made Chicago what it was at this time. So what this also did was it linked the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes watersheds together, which had some implications we'll talk about soon. So these canals allowed a first wave of harmful invasive species to come into the Great Lakes. There's the sea lamprey, which is shown here. It's native to the East Coast, got into the Great Lakes through the canals, absolutely decimating populations of lake trout, which were the native apex predator for the system. This is an ecosystem that did not have a huge abundance of top predators. Lake trout was it, and its populations collapsed in the early 1900s because of sea lamprey. The other one I want to mention is alewife, which is a small fish from the East Coast that also moved through the canals, established in the Great Lakes, and proliferated during the early 1900s. It did really well because lake trout were gone. The native top predator collapsed because of sea lamprey. There's no top predators in the system. Alewife get in, and their populations proliferated to the point of where they comprised 90% of the biomass of fish in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron in the 1960s. I want to mention one last thing, which is the St. Lawrence Seaway, which was opened up in 1959. So ships were now moving, Ships were moving through canals, and there was, an increase in trade. But the big vision was to allow large ocean-going vessels to come through the Gulf of St. Lawrence into the Great Lakes. Okay, so ships could come in here, and the possibility here was that this would open up the Great Lakes as the fourth coast, and ships would go to Chicago or Cleveland instead of New York City, and we would become part of the global shipping world. So what they did was they created a seaway or a canal through the St. Lawrence River between Lake Ontario and Montreal. There are some gnarly rapids there, and it was a major public works project that cost billions of dollars. It was a collaborative project between the Canadians and the Americans. Really, it was, at the time, a mind-blowingly large investment of resources to open up the Great Lakes to ships. And so here's a picture of that. It was the 1950s. Hey, let's think big. Let's use technology to revolutionize everything. Here's the St. Lawrence Seaway today. And the problem with the St. Lawrence Seaway was that when they built it, it was too small for the ships of the future. Ocean-going vessels increased in size rapidly through this period. By the time they were building the seaway, it was too small for the current fleet of ships to move through. So at this time, very few ships move through the seaway. It's responsible for about 5% of the Great Lakes traffic via ship. 95% of the shipping traffic in the Great Lakes is from one port to another within the Great Lakes. So it's actually a minor contributor to shipping within the Great Lakes Basin, but it has been an important contributor of something else that resides in ballast tanks. Ships bring on ballast water from ports. They'll release that into other ports. And these ballast tanks from these ships that had been in ports from around the world released their water into the Great Lakes and brought about an absolute onslaught of invasive species. And so we look at zebra mussels, spiny water flea, hemimysis, round goby, and dozens of other species from around the world were brought into the Great Lakes as a consequence of transport of species through ballast water. So not a lot of cargo moving through there, but there was a lot of biological diversity moving through there. And as these species were brought into a naive and isolated fauna, when they had already been impacted by alewives and lamprey and a few other earlier invasive species, the consequences for the food web in the ecosystem were immense. And we saw what you could describe as an ecosystem or a food web collapse in the Great Lakes as a consequence of this. Here are a series of ciscos that are native to the Great Lakes. Different combinations of these species inhabited each of the Great Lakes. This is the series of deep water ciscos for Lake Michigan. These were decimated as a consequence of the two waves of invasions, the alewife/lamprey and the later ones. But these were really decimated more early on. Lake trout populations were similarly decimated. And as I mentioned, their stock diversity was greatly degraded as well. So many of these native species declined, and what we saw was a non-native dominated food web filling the void. Alewives reached immense populations through the mid-1900s. It's a small forage fish. As I mentioned, occupied 90% of the biomass of Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. And this species started to undergo massive die-offs in the 1960s with trillions of dead fish washing up on beaches. So we're seeing a sort of an unstable food web and this sort of really out of control food web collapse. Fisheries managers from Michigan began stocking Pacific salmon, and it was remarkably successful. Salmon were feeding on the alewives, they proliferated, and their populations took off, creating a recreational fishery for salmon. But what happened was that Dracaenid mussels came into the system and undermined the productivity of the ecosystem. So what we had was a food web with alewives being fed upon by Pacific salmon, but with overstocking of Pacific salmon and then Dracaenid mussels undermining the base of the food web, we saw a collapse of the alewives and the other forage fish species. So what this graph shows is the abundance of the forage fish, the small fish, over the last 40 years or so. And you see through the 70s and 80s, they were at high densities. Over the last 10 years, their populations have declined due to that 1-2 punch of being undermined at the bottom and at the top. So we're currently at a situation where that forage base has basically collapsed. And what's happened in the last few years is that there are some signs of the recovery of the native species and the native ecosystems. Without alewife, many of the native species have been able to recruit, and that's because alewife feed on the young of the year of many native species. So the loss of alewife has opened up some opportunities for native species, and some native species have figured out how to feed on some of the new invasives. And I want to point specifically to round goby, a small benthic fish. It feeds on zebra mussels, and it's incredibly abundant in the ecosystem. Many of the native fish have turned to feeding on round gobies, and they're doing all right. So essentially what happened is that we screwed up the ecosystem so much that the native species began to recover by accident. So I think there's some hope there. So yeah, it's ironic, isn't it? But it's sort of true. I want to touch on one last element of this Great Lakes story, which is Great Lakes as a beachhead for secondary spread to inland ecosystems. So these 187 species from around the world are now living in the Great Lakes, and some of them are trickling their way inland. I have a list here of species that we consider Great Lakes inland spreaders making their way and causing another round of biological invasions on the landscape within the Great Lakes Basin and beyond. Often they're transported inland by recreational boaters like this, and it's a phenomenon where the spread rate is often pretty slow. So they're appearing here and there in new ecosystems, but they're somewhat dispersal limited. Again, we're talking about inland ecosystems that might be isolated, and it requires people to transport them there for the invasion to happen. And as a consequence, there's a lot of local invasive species management efforts by states and by counties to try to keep these Great Lakes invaders from moving into all of these inland waters. The magnitude of this problem is huge. If we look at the state of Wisconsin as an example, we measure the length of the Great Lakes shoreline in the state, we're talking about 1,300 kilometers of shoreline. That's a lot of habitat. But if we look at the inland lakes in Wisconsin alone, we measure all the shoreline of those lakes, it's about 51,000 kilometers. So we actually have tremendous amounts of inland habitat compared to Great Lakes habitat that now needs to be protected from all these Great Lakes invaders that basically came in because of the canals and the ballast water. And so what this is meaning is that there's this whole new level of invasive species management and prevention that needs to happen as an aftershock to these Great Lakes invasions. All right, so to summarize, it was broad-scale isolation that was really responsible for that unique biodiversity of the Great Lakes system. The system was highly naive, and it was highly sensitive to this onslaught of invasive species that we saw. Early on, we saw loss of local connectivity from dams and habitat destruction. So really, it was originally declining connectivity. But the next chapter in the Great Lakes story was an increase in global connectivity as ships from the world plied through the St. Lawrence Seaway, bringing their ballast water and bringing literally hundreds of non-native species into the ecosystem, causing ecosystem disruption. And now what we're seeing is a new chapter where these Great Lakes invaders are making their way slowly marching into the inland lakes and streams of not only the Great Lakes Basin, but all of North America. And so this is something that's going to be playing out for hundreds of years, and it's going to cause invasive species management challenges to continue for our lifetimes. So how do we manage freshwater connectivity in an invaded world? I think we'll leave that for the panel discussion. All right, so thank you.
Thank you, Jake. Excellent talk, of course. We have time for a few questions. You know, professors, we just say hi and then we can speak for an hour. So there's maybe less time that we hope for the panel, but if there's some question, there's the microphones. Yes?
Hi, I'm Cheryl with WCS Canada. That was a fascinating panel. Thank you very much for bringing that to us. Dr. Creed, what's the sort of scientific evidence between the 8-to-1 ratios for those wetlands, and how's that working for Alberta?
The scientific basis for it was to achieve an overall ratio of 3:1. And so that is based on what the policy was before that, the interim wetland policy. And so for every 1 hectare of wetland that was gone, it was to be replaced by 3:1. And so the magic of the 1 and up to 8 for the D-class wetlands on average is to obtain that 3:1 ratio. And how's it going? It's just the policy was implemented not that long ago. I think it's early days to see what will happen. I think that there's a lot more work to be done, and obviously we need to start monitoring the success of some of these policy implementations, because I'm sure that we've adopted a policy of continuous improvement. We're going to see how this plays out on the landscape, at least the government people now that are leading it, and that they will do a renew or refresh every few years just to make sure that those targets are being met.
Hi, Neil Taylor, Toronto Region Conservation. I had a question for Dr. Creed as well. Thank you for your presentation, and I was interested in particular in those, relations between wetland and flooding, and I work with wetlands, and you often include statements in proposals and about the benefits of wetlands. Some of those reductions in peak flow values were really phenomenal, but I'm just wondering, in your perspective, wetlands by their very nature have, from a hydrological perspective, limited storage volumes. They're already very full of water. So for those riparian wetlands, do you think that leaving the floodplain as open space or as any other type of ecosystem would be similarly effective? Or what is contributing to that peak flow reduction, in your view?
I think it's a good question. It's a complicated answer. When you look at the region where those study results were presented, it's in southern Alberta, relatively dry place. You can imagine that the bucket's not full in many of those wetlands, and so they still have untapped into potential for water storage. The analysis that we did was based on the historical wetlands, and so what I think this has promise of showing is where we can strategically look to restoring wetlands even beyond the floodplain to help mitigate those flood potentials. But I also want to remind that it's not just about the water, it's also about the nutrient pollution. And other studies that we've done have shown that wetlands that are far away from the main water stem are really good at removing phosphorus, but those that are really close to the main stem are really good at denitrifying nitrogen. And so it's a complicated answer because we have to look at multiple objectives, both of the flood potential, the nutrient pollution, and of course the biodiversity.
Hi, my question's for also Dr. Creed. One thing I thought was, I was surprised you didn't have any mention of beavers in retention of water as well as connectivity between the wetlands that you talk about. So they seem to be the vector that creates many of these and also creates the connectivity of it and holds, Glenn Hood's work has shown that they've retained a lot of water, especially during times of climate change. So it would seem that if you wanted to really protect them, you would protect the species that is the vector. In other words, put limits on trapping, and they could solve a lot of it and also add all the biodiversity. So I'm just wondering why that's not in that show that you went through.
I think that although Marie-Josée said that I was a multidisciplinary scientist, my expertise does not go to that extent. I do know colleagues of mine who are working on beavers and the connectivity of them, and that's something we can definitely add to it. But in the geographic area that I focused on, mostly agricultural, as far as I could tell, the beaver presence was minimal. It becomes much more important as you go further north.
Okay, thank you.
I will take the last question. It's my privilege, right? So I have a question for maybe Julian and Jake. Both of you, directly or indirectly, you talk about temporal connectivity. So could you tell us how you envision, Julian, you talk about the phenology. So do you see that we can, because I know he work on a stream that are ephemeral, so there's also the lack of water, that the fluctuation, so maybe, and Jake, you had the food web and the wave of invasions. Maybe just a few words to close.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the challenges that I think connectivity comes in many forms, some of which are controllable and others aren't. So you mentioned the fact that the large majority, for example, the large majority of rivers in the United States are actually intermittent or ephemeral, and that raises issues around the Clean Water Act as well. But and many of those systems are naturally fragmented through stream drying. So I work in the desert Southwest, where stream drying is actually a really important agent to fragment landscapes and actually prevent non-native species from going into headwaters where there are refuges for native fish only. So there's been a lot of ways, again, to go back to kind of dam management. In California, for example, there's issues or thinking about ways in which the argument has been made that large dams might be a savior in the sense in which water can be held back and then released to increase connectivity, for example, to allow what remaining Pacific salmon there are to reach up into headwaters. There's also these issues that connectivity is not just physical, but it's also water quality. So stream temperature is a major barrier, particularly it will be a larger barrier in terms of movement of organisms in the future. So cold water releases from dams are now being used again in California as a way to keep habitats connected by keeping it cooler during the summertime in which it would be normally fragmented. So I think obviously as conservation biologists, we're always struggle with thinking about ways in which problems can then turn themselves into solutions sometimes.
I think you touched on a key point there. I just wanted to mention from the lake's perspective, I think there are opportunities for us to still manage connectivity and to do it in a preventative way. And so keeping new invasives from coming into the Great Lakes through the seaway is the obvious thing, I think, priority in terms of management. And we still have ships moving through the seaway, potentially bringing new species in. It's slowed down because of some policy initiatives, but I mean, if we want to focus on the pinch points with regard to new invasive species coming in the seaway, Chicago Shipping Canal are the obvious targets for focusing on the critical aspects of connectivity.
I see someone there. You want to have a quick question?
Yeah, quick question. My question is for Dr. Olden. I was just curious when you're talking about selective connectivity, whether, I know you said in some cases you're able to still screen and pull out the fish that don't meet whatever criteria it is that you're using, but I'm wondering in other cases if there's the potential for the unintended consequence of basically artificial selection for example, maybe smaller fish if you're screening for a certain size. I just wonder whether that's been looked at.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think there's challenges with, for me, over-managing the systems in which we want to function and show resilience independently in the long term. And some of the challenges are that. There's challenges that we're setting up ecological traps in a lot of these cases by providing access upstream to then poor habitat. And that's another way in which barriers are actually getting used, for example, with salmon again, to divert them into better tributaries in terms of spawning success. So just as a launching point off just from that a little bit, I think I'm very weary, I think we'd all agree, in the sense of over-managing our systems to an extent in which we are actually just the puppeteer in the way in which biological organisms are being moved around. So for me, the way in which we manage mosaics, especially in a coordinated fashion where some activities might actually underpin other upstream activities, remains just a really, really critical issue. So a free-flowing river, in my opinion, despite with invasive species being around, is always a preferred option over a fragmented system.
Well, let's thank our speaker. They will be here this afternoon, obviously, so you can ask them more questions. Thank you again.